To our webinar on robotics careers. We're so excited to speak with you today about what you can do today and what you can look forward to in your nanodegree program to prepare you for a job. My name is Trin Nguyen. I am a program coordinator on the careers team where I build career services and content. I'm with my awesome colleague right here. I'll let him introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Mike Salem. I'm the robotics service lead for the Robotics Nanodegree Program.
Mike, I'm really excited to talk with you today because I think your story of how you got into robotics is a little bit interesting. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so robotics it's been an interesting field for me when I first started. So a little bit of background about myself. I actually went to school for mathematics. So I have a bachelor's and a master's degree in mathematics. After I graduated school in 2008, so I don't know how familiar you are with that time, but that's probably like the absolute worst time you could probably come out of school in the last 2 decades. So there was a huge market crash, a lot of companies weren't hiring. So my original goal actually was I wanted to work in supply chain and production systems. That's what I was studying while I was in grad school. And after a while, jobs are kind of slim, so you start just kind of looking around and expanding out where you can go and what you can do. And I had an interview with a company for a software engineer role, and they were a robotics company. So what they were is they were a government contractor that worked on building ground control stations for UAVs. So this is like, almost 10 years ago now?
And what's a UAV, sorry?
So UAV is an unmanned aerial vehicle.
Okay.
So basically, the fancy name now is drones, right?
Oh, I see.
From a military perspective, they don't like to refer to them as drones because they have negative connotations associated with that. So sometimes you'll see things like UAV, you'll see things like RPV, which is a remote piloted vehicle, UAS, which is unmanned aerial systems, drones, they're all kind of the same thing.
Gotcha.
So what we did is we actually built the ground control stations that would actually talk to the vehicle. So you could actually, a soldier in the field could actually fly the vehicle based on what they were holding in their hand at the time.
Okay, that's so interesting.
Yeah.
I've talking with you these past months, Mike, I've learned a lot about robotics. When I first heard the term, I heard we were launching this nanodegree program, I kind of imagined it as very machinery. I kind of thought it akin to a mechanical engineer role, and I realized it's quite different. So could you talk a bit about it's an interdisciplinary field, what would you say would be the buckets in robotics?
Yeah, so robotics is kind of a strange beast, right? And the reason it's so strange is because it covers such a broad focus and a wide area of expertise. So to be a roboticist, I mean, you can be involved in just different components or different aspects of what's going on. One of those aspects is, software. You can be writing software to actually work on the robot, to actually do some sort of artificial intelligence or machine learning. You can actually do some work with hardware. You can actually build the robot. There's other areas of robotics which kind of get a little bit less press, I think, than sometimes they deserve, which is like human-robot interaction. So for instance, if I'm building a social robot, how it looks and acts and behaves with people is very important, and I think sometimes is overlooked. We've seen some companies work with like writers, hiring people to actually do scripts. There's just all kinds of different areas that you can actually be involved with in terms of robotics. So to kind of say what are some of the main areas, I would say hardware is a main area, some sort of mechanical engineering background. Electrical is really good, software is really good. But then there's just a wide variety of other skills that you can have and still kind of work in that field. So for instance, I'm a mathematician, algorithms and motion planning and path planning. Those are things that I would be a little bit better suited for, which could allow me to work in the field of robotics as well. That's
really, when you mentioned all those skills like software engineering, mechanical engineering, mathematics, it kind of put light bulbs in my head because I work with students in all nanodegree programs, and they all have very different backgrounds, and it's so interesting to see how they find their niche in fields that they thought had no relevance to what they were interested in. I was kind of surprised when I first learned that in robotics they're really pushing the barrier. I admit that I had a preconception that robots were drones, they were Mars rovers, stuff like that. And then I found out there are robotics jobs where linguists are so important, psychologists are so important, and it's because of that human interaction, right? Would you say kind of that is what robotics is aiming toward, trying to build a robot that is I guess, like focus on human interaction?
So I think there's been a huge shift in the way that like robots have been perceived, especially in the last 15 to 20 years. Most robots, if you look back 20 years ago or so, were much more industrial, right? It was much more these big mechanical arms that would move, huge cars through factory lines, and just UAVs as an example of things that were they were meant for either military use or they were meant for big production type of use. And I think lately, because the components have gotten so much cheaper and smaller and easier for a hobbyist to pick up, that people are doing things that are much more in a consumer space. So, for instance, one of those huge arms, like for instance, one of our partners, KUKA, right? A KUKA arm can cost you anywhere from tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? That's just not feasible for me to own at home. But for an industry, it is. Now, there's some other companies out there that do like consumer robots. So Mayfield Robotics is a nice one. Catalia Health has a nice robot that they're using for healthcare, right? These are much smaller, much easier to use, and actually engaging with the family. So I think how we view robots has shifted. I think the potential has always been there, and I just think now that the hardware is getting cheap enough, we can actually work with those things on that kind of a scale.
I love to hear that. I love to hear where the industry is going, because it means these robotics hubs are popping up around the world, where there'll just be more opportunity geographically in places outside of the US. I know you mentioned to me that in Asia and Western Europe, robotics hubs are really popping up. Where would you say kind of are the main hubs? Yeah,
so a lot of the hubs, there's a lot of hubs worldwide. Typically some of the biggest hubs in the United States have been the Boston area, greater Boston area has always been a big hub. Obviously MIT and Harvard and some of the great schools that you have over there kind of have led the way from a mechanical side. And as software has become more and more important, you've seen Silicon Valley kind of pop up and seen a lot of robotics jobs actually starting to move here and kind of evolve here, which has been great. So a lot of the hardware now is also migrating over into this way. So as far as the US goes, I think those are two of the biggest hubs, right? I mean, there's hubs everywhere. I mean, I think there's some stuff going on in Texas right now. There's some stuff going on in Washington State. Virginia is another place as well. So it's really kind of all over the place. Pittsburgh as well, excuse me. Don't want to forget that. So in the US, it's kind of spread out. There's a good sector kind of somewhere geologically close to you. As far as worldwide goes, I would say that Australia has some nice hubs on the eastern coast of Australia, near Brisbane and Sydney. China has some pretty big hubs. India also has quite a large robotics community, and UK and Germany, I would say, are probably some of the other big leaders in the area. Unfortunately, I don't know of anything in South America or off the top of my head, or Africa.
I'm sure there are. Like the story you just told me seems very similar to software engineering in general. Like it started off like in pockets, in Harvard, in Palo Alto, all these things, and then now it's literally everywhere. In rural areas, like software engineering is used in everything, and I feel like robotics it may not be there yet, but it's trending upward to be more ubiquitous across the world.
Yeah, so the way I look at robotics right now is kind of where self-driving cars were back in 2011, 2012 era, where it was a really cool idea, but you had to work at Google kind of more or less to be doing that type of research. And now you're seeing it kind of open up 5 years later. So I think robotics is right on that cusp, right before that tipping point, before we start seeing a real explosion worldwide. Now the difference between something like, let's say, a self-driving car and just general robotics is, the amount of possibilities that you have to kind of work in those fields is so much greater. So for instance, you could work on mobile robots, you can work on industrial robots, you can work on healthcare robots, social robots, underwater robots. There's a lot of potential in a lot of places that you can actually work, and a lot of different avenues that you can explore.
That tells me, like, even if a job seeker is not in a hub, like they're in an area where there may not be a big robotics company, or even opportunities for them to network with robotics community, they are still able to find a job, like kind of what you just mentioned, that will kind of lead them on that roboticist path.
Yeah, so I think that's possible. I kind of stumbled into my robotics career. Actually, I interviewed as a software engineer, as a mathematician, and I ended up getting the job. So I learned a lot on the job, actually. So I think if you're willing to learn and willing to kind of try and be relentless, I think that it's possible to kind of lead to a job in robotics anywhere. as far as taking a job that might not be directly related to the field, there's still a lot of knowledge you can gain. So for instance, if you're somebody who has a good mechanical background but don't know how to code, working in the software realm a little bit will help you kind of tie those two things together. Or somebody who works in the software realm that's never done any hardware, it'll give them the opportunity to kind of, branch out and explore that area. And then you might not end up being an expert, right? For instance, I don't think I would personally be as good as somebody who has, a huge background in, mechanical engineering or human-robot interaction, but I can learn a little bit and become more of a generalist. A good place for you to actually start if you want to get some experience kind of working with hardware, software together is actually the Internet of Things. It's a really easy way to kind of get going. You can buy yourself a Raspberry Pi or an Arduino, and I know for some of our students out there, Term 2 is actually coming with hardware, which we haven't released just yet, so stay tuned for that. But you can work with some of these areas to kind of get a little feel for how things work, how motors work, how actuators work, how sensors work, and this eventually just kind of expands you into that field. You start feeling comfortable with, well, I've already figured out how to move a servo. What if I attach the servo to a camera, let's say, right? And now I built a gimbal. Now I basically have what you consider like an eye, right? I could track things and move things around because the camera is no longer static. So it's kind of a good branch and kind of a good step to kind of get you really kind of engulfed in that field.
I see that story a lot outside of robotics, just in general with nanodegree students. When they want to, let's say, become like an engineer and they come from a background without any computer science, they kind of enter a company, a tech company, without, in a like kind of akin role, and then just they build knowledge, they build company knowledge, they see what other engineers do. So when the time comes to hire another engineer, they're the best candidate for it. Because not only do they have the knowledge, they have a bit of industry insight. To someone, because your students right now, the robotics students right now, are still going through the nanodegree, they're very early in it. How would you say they can build their knowledge outside of the nanodegree right now? Like, are there blog posts they should read, conferences to go to, videos to watch?
So there's a lot of things, a lot of ways you can get involved. I think the easiest way to get involved is just start building something yourself. Try working on it, try to get a group of people together, maybe it's some friends, buy some pizza, hang out in a garage, and say, we're going to build this today. And it might work, it might not, but that's okay. It's all about the learning experience. As far as kind of conferences and things like that, Silicon Valley Robotics is a great organization. They're worldwide, so there's a lot of events that they hold that you can become a member for, become a professional member, and kind of get to network with other people in the field. It's a good way to gather insight, and just making sure you're going to those conferences. One of the big things that we're focused on right now for our engagement week this week that we're actually launching is kind of getting used to the idea of doing research paper reads. So that's a really good way to see kind of what's going on in the field right now and figuring out what's the next step. What are people looking at right now that maybe can't be implemented just yet, but they're working towards. So for instance, this week we're looking at biologically inspired robots. And one of the papers is actually on RATSLAM, which instead of using like a radar or a sonar or a LiDAR, to actually do a lot of your localization, it's done with just purely cameras. Now this is something they're looking to potentially deploy in Australia in some of their mines because they have some problems with doing the localization down there. So they've studied a rat to figure out how a rat kind of migrates around a maze and navigates. And they're trying to do something similar with the camera, which is really kind of fascinating. So I think kind of looking at this cutting edge work is a good way to kind of get going. As far as news articles go, I like IEEE Spectrum on robotics. I think they do a good job. I think they have really good, credible articles. But really read whatever interests you. I mean, just because, so there's a lot of articles that are doom and gloom, right? And there's a lot of, robots are going to replace all of our jobs by 2020, right? Like, I believe in the UK, I think they're predicting 2030 by 60% of their workforce or something like that. I'm making the numbers up off the top of my head. I would have to go back and check it, so please don't cite me on that. But I think it's far overblown. I think there's a lot of hysteria. I think there's going to be actually a lot of new jobs that kind of spawn from this. So I think trying to find good reputable sources, good academic sources, and just kind of having, be a scientist, right? Yeah. Be skeptical on both sides, right? So don't take everything you read at face value. Look for another source and make sure that you're trying to find some sort of ground truth. But I think there's a lot of things out there for students to read.
I love that you brought all of this up because you gave our students like a lot of suggestions on how they can just learn more. And this is true across all industries. It doesn't matter if you're in tech, outside of tech, whatever. Employers love to see it when they see that you're a learner because your job will grow. You will have to take on new projects, especially in an emerging, I wouldn't say it's emerging, but like in an innovative field like robotics. You can come in thinking you're gonna build a robot this way, and then this hot new thing comes out, and then you have to build it another way. And a message to students, when you're talking to employers, when you're interviewing, they always love to hear you reference articles. A common interview question that I get is like, tell me about a blog post you recently read about what you're interested in. It tells them that you're serious, that you're really passionate, and that you'll always bring new ideas to the company because you're immersed in this field. It also really helps them. A lot of our students are doing career changes right now, and a kind of battle that career changers have to do is to prove that you're really interested in this career change. Like you've thought about it, you're committed to it, and the more you can talk about the new field and speak kind of like you've been there all along, the more people will believe you that you're and kind of accept this career change and see you as the role you want to be.
And I want to echo that sentiment actually, Trin. It's a really good point. A lot of companies, if you just kind of eat, breathe, and live robotics, right? Or a field that you're passionate about in general, it really kind of comes through in your interviews. And people will be, even if you don't have quite the experience they're looking for, they feel like there's somebody that they can work with, somebody they can invest their time with. Whereas I know I've been on the other side of the coin where I've seen people who've had great experience, but might not necessarily have the passion that I would be looking for to kind of work on a project. And that can be detrimental as well. So really kind of conveying that you have that enthusiasm and that attitude of I'm a self-learner, I'm a self-starter. I like to go in and look at things on my own, and I do this because I enjoy it, not because my end goal is just to get a job in this field. I'm doing it because I'm really passionate about it. Really goes a long way with a lot of folks.
For sure. When I talked with engineers across the board, engineering managers tend to tell me that if there are senior engineers on the team, they believe they can teach anybody, teach anyone to learn any language, any skills. But if they kind of get a candidate that is not good at communication, is not good at teamwork, that's something that's hard to overcome. You mentioned a couple of really great kind of behavioral skills, like being a self-starter. Do you think there are any of those kind of I don't like the word soft skills, but you kind of know what I'm getting at, like the non-technical skills that are really important for robotics, documentation, perhaps?
I think documentation is a good thing, but I really think the communication just in general, being a good verbal communicator, because there's a lot of times that you'll have to work in a team. Robotics is pretty much a team sport, is the way I look at it, right? It's not like let's say golf or something like that, where I can kind of go out on my own and do my own thing, and I can get really good without having to talk to anybody or learn from anybody else. Robotics is very much, you have to communicate, you have to work with your team, because like I said, it's very uncommon to find somebody who's an expert mechanical engineer, an expert computer scientist, an expert at algorithm development and motion modeling, right? An expert at computer vision. These people just typically don't exist. And if they do exist, they're starting their own company and working by themselves, which is phenomenal, right? And I applaud them. So I think having that set of skills to be able to kind of communicate and work in a team is a huge piece of the puzzle. So not just technically sound, you might be technically sound in your area, but if you can't communicate, you can't collaborate, and can't work together, that's a huge red flag, I think, for a lot of companies.
Okay, cool. So we've talked a bit about kind of what companies are looking for. Let's change topics into what the job search process is like in robotics.
Sure.
I know when people who don't have a technical background pursue a technical job, they're kind of like, oh, I didn't realize a technical interview, a take-home are things. So what would you say? I know it's probably not typical. There's not one typical, this is what you do, these are the steps, your interview steps, but what should students expect if they say, for example, if they apply to a job and they get a recruiter reaching out to them?
Sure. So it's really an interesting question, right? Because there's a lot of pieces to the robotics industry, right? And especially for interviewing. A lot of times what happens is if you apply for a position and you hear back, it's usually a recruiter or somebody from the company that might have a little bit more soft skills, just kind of doing a glance over at your resume, make sure everything looks okay, asking you to communicate, talk a little bit about some of the projects that you've done or some of your experience and why you think you'd be a good fit for this role. Usually from there you end up going into a technical interview, which is usually a phone interview. So for me, I was focused more towards the software side of things, so not so much the hardware. So a lot of times I would get coding challenges, or I'd have to do coding interviews over the phone. And if those go well, you typically go for an on-site where you're kind of asked more of the same throughout the day. Now, as far as what questions you should be prepared to answer, it really depends on the company. I've been asked all kinds of different things in all of my interviews. A wide gamut of stuff. So it's really hard to kind of sit down and really prepare. So my advice is to just try to find an area that you're really passionate about. Make sure that you kind of research that company a little bit and try to figure out, what their skills are and what they're looking for. And the best way to find out what you would be asked is to be able to try and talk to some of those folks ahead of time. Try to meet them, see if they're going to a conference that you want to attend, or they're part of a meetup group, and just kind of pick their brain and say, well, what I need when I work there, is there anything I should do to kind of make myself more marketable once I start this process for the interview? I think those are some of the things that I've kind of seen that might help. But to kind of get back to your question, it's usually, the format is usually some sort of soft skill, some sort of technical interview, some sort of on-site, and usually some decision after that.
Okay, cool. At any point during this time, do you, of course you speak about your experiences, but do they ever look at your projects really in depth? Do they kind of, if someone comes in, for example, for a developer, they expect you to have a GitHub, and they're going to look through it. For roboticists, what would be kind of the little pieces of the portfolio?
So I think really the biggest thing outside of taking classes is important to kind of help expand and grow your knowledge, but I think really the big thing is doing projects. And one of the things in particular that helps if you want to work in robotics is to have some sort of robot. It doesn't have to be anything spectacular. It's not like you have to go buy a $2,000 or $3,000 robot that you can work with at home. It can be something as simple as an Octobotics base, which is like $15 to $20, an Arduino or a Raspberry Pi, which is under $40, and kind of putting things together and kind of showing people hey, I've played around with this. And there's a huge disconnect from people who come from a software side and want to work on robots, in my opinion, if they've never done any hardware. Because when you do things in simulation is wonderful, and everything works as expected typically in simulation, but whenever you actually work with physical hardware, there's always some sort of nuance and things go kind of awry. So being able to, speak intelligently about those experiences that you've had, I think is a huge plus. When I would talk to a lot of companies, one of the questions they typically ask me is, so what kind of robots have you built? What kind of robots have you worked on? It's usually one of the first questions they like to ask, just to kind of get a feel for where your knowledge is and where your experience lies. My background prior to Udacity was in hiring, and from an employer's perspective, kind of that is what we'd love to see. It doesn't, like you said, it doesn't have to be this big thing, but if you can say I tried to do this, and and be honest, saying, hey, I didn't have the resources to build this feature, but if I did, this is how I would do it. It just starts a conversation. It actually lets the employer see how you think, how you think about robots, how you would approach if you had all the resources to build one, and it just gives them insight that you really understand what's needed. And I also think it shows a little bit of passion as well, right? So
sure.
there's an interesting way of asking somebody, so tell me about this project, so what are you working on? What made you choose to do something like this, right? And usually someone's like, oh, well, I had this idea that, there's somebody in our community who was actually working on this. I'm sorry, I forgot your name off the top of my head, but they had built an arm that actually would grab cereal from one bowl and move it into the next bowl, right? And I forget their motivation for doing it, but you could tell they were excited about it. And those are great things. And those are things that if you're on the other side of the table, you want to see, because you want to hear people talk and be excited and engaged. So I think that's a huge piece.
Okay. That's awesome. I can speak now kind of as to how we, later on in the Nanodegree program, we're going to kind of teach students how to communicate that passion. So I think when you search for a job, you have different audiences. Like Mike mentioned, you may speak to a recruiter who may not know exactly what the role does day to day. And then you'll obviously speak to your potential manager and other experts. And kind of there are certain strategies that we'll present. We'll have, in later engagement weeks, we'll have parts and modules on how to present yourself, how to give a pitch. And when I say pitch, I don't mean a sales pitch. I just mean, how do you talk about where you come from, what you're interested in, and why you're interested in a company. There's a bunch of strategy to go into it, a lot of exercises, so really excited to share that with you soon. For me, my recommendation to students right now to kind of get started on that is to really be clear about why you're interested. You don't have to be specific, I want to be, this role. You don't have to be that specific, but more of I'm interested in robots because I really want to work in healthcare, and I see a lot of innovation there. Over time, kind of you'll think over your passion over and over again, and then by the time you're ready to search for a job, you kind of have this amazing story to tell people.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think from a careers perspective, though, I think a lot of our students out there, one of the number one questions I always get is, how do I break into the field? Right? And I try to say it's just you got to do something. You got to put something together. That's the best way to learn. What do you recommend for folks who might not necessarily have, advanced degrees? So typically a lot of these positions, you see them, they're PhD, 5 years of experience, or DARPA challenge experience, or master's degrees with 3 years in the lab. What do you recommend for some of the students who might not have some of those skills? Like, what things would careers kind of suggest outside of that? I understand, like, I would probably suggest, like, build projects, right?
Sure.
And put those projects together. But from a careers perspective, how would I try to market myself to kind of show those things off, to kind of make me stand out amongst, like, some of these people with advanced degrees?
So let me start with kind of telling you a story about where when we launched the machine learning engineer program a couple years back, we kind of encountered that same issue where we had smart students who, some of them had high school diplomas, no college experience, and they went through the Nanodegree program and aced it. And then they went out into the job market and they realized, I don't even have a college degree, but how in the world can I become a machine learning engineer when these job postings may say PhD required? Sure. So I think, I know, like, people talk about online dating a lot as, like, that's what job searching is, but it's really, like, about just putting your best self out there. And if you feel like, you have a gap somewhere, you strengthen the other parts of it. So let's say, for example, you don't have a computer science degree. Think about what people who have that degree would have. Like, would they have connections? Would they know, like, would they have read books, like, really, and have that industry knowledge? And you seek that out. Go to events. I think, going to events is the best part. I recently worked with a student who, he had no prior work experience, period. And he was trying to break into the tech industry. And on paper, like, on his resume, he could tell that he did not look that great, just because he didn't really have much to put on it. Sure. So he went to networking event after networking event, and he told this story. He got to know people. He was able to pick up some projects because people, included him in their teams. And he was able to get some personal projects. And over time, people started seeing him as a developer, even though he didn't actually have a developer job before. And so when it came time for him to, like, find a job, someone actually referred him, like, I've seen how you work, and I think you'll be good, even though you don't have this experience. So this is another, like, really important thing when you're trying to make a career change or break into the industry. Take the opportunities that come to you. Even if it's short term, even if it's not what you expected, it's anything that you can put on your resume that says you know a bit about robotics, that you know a bit about working in this field, will just make you a better candidate. We see this a lot. A lot of people take on like contract roles or just like short-term internships, and then they usually almost always lead to a full-time job. Because robotics, this industry is, I see it because it's growing so much. Like, if you learn like 5 more things, you're gonna learn 5 more things than many other people. So all of a sudden, you are like a good candidate for the job. Mm-hmm. So to echo what Mike said, build projects, because that's the way that you can build experience without having a job. Attend networking events, and try to just sell your case to people. If you met with an employer and they're like, why should I hire you? Talk about your passion. Talk like you are already in the industry. Talk about the skills you have, and then I think people will be accepting of that. And if I do have to tell you that there is some education bias. Like Mike mentioned how there are so many research papers in robotics. So if people have PhD candidates, obviously they have an advantage, but that doesn't mean you can't enter like the field in a different way, mm-hmm. and then build up to it. For example, in machine learning, a lot of students who didn't have, who encounter that education bias, they actually became data analysts. That was a lower barrier, and worked on machine learning projects, and then eventually were promoted to becoming data scientists, machine learning engineers.
Yeah, so I think it's a good point you mentioned, Trin. Mm-hmm. You might not get the job that you want right away, mm-hmm. but you can find a way to get your foot in the door, mm-hmm. and kind of build up to that.
For sure. And that's true for everything. Like, I obviously did not have the job I wanted out of college.
Sure. So for from a careers perspective, one of the things I typically have a lot of difficulty with is, say, for instance, I'm looking at a company and I've researched this company and I feel really good about this company, but I want to go talk to the company. And as soon as I feel like I have to go approach somebody to kind of sell myself, I feel like I fall flat. I feel like I feel like I'm bragging. I feel like I'm either trying to oversell myself or oversell my skills because I might not feel confident yet, depending on what I know. How do you overcome that? Is there anything the careers team kind of offers to help people kind of go through this process to kind of build up that kind of confidence so that they can feel like, hey, I can go, so-and-so, the CEO of this company is going to be at this networking event. I want to go over and talk to them, and I'm just going to introduce myself, and I'm going to get the ball rolling that way. Is there anything that the careers offers?
Yeah. Later on in the Nanodegree program, I mentioned, in later engagement weeks, we'll have more career content. There are going to be modules and projects that you can submit. For example, if you're having a hard time presenting yourself on LinkedIn, a reviewer, you'll get a personalized review, and people will help you kind of walk through how you present yourself. We also offer career counselor appointments after you've completed a couple career projects. It's a chance to talk to someone. I've held career counselor appointments before as the counselor. I've done everything from talking over someone's pitch with them to talking out scenarios. We provide kind of these interactions with students so they can practice, but really it's up to, we'll provide you resources and kind of like ideas for you to get more comfortable communicating. What really works for me actually is that I drive a lot, and I just think over, like, if I met someone today, how would I describe what I did yesterday at Udacity? I get really nervous. I know I'm on camera right now, but the first time I went to a networking event, I almost cried. I was so nervous, and I couldn't even tell them that I was my name. I was so nervous. So I just got comfortable. You don't want to talk like you're reading a script, but just if I know 3 points I want to tell someone about this project I worked on, if I just run it over my head, I'll be confident. I also recommend writing blogs. Something that a lot of people do, they have a Today I Learned, TIL, repo or blog post where they just write about the little bits that they learned today, and it just makes it easier for you to, once you write it down, to communicate when you're talking to someone live, because you already have something to pull from. You've already thought over something.
That's great, Trin. And one thing I do want to add, because I don't know if we touched upon this yet, but those career options are only available for our students. So
for sure.
Unfortunately, some of you who are in the community who are not part of the Udacity program, make sure you sign up so you can talk to folks like Trin.
And there's a page on our Career Resource Center that is one of the career options we have that is public. We do have a list of career services that only Udacity students receive, so we'll make sure you get that after the webinar.
Great. And I think kind of going back to your experience of kind of being shy and freaking out at networking events, I've been to several networking events myself, and I can say that I personally feel the exact same way that you do. I walk into a room and there's 200 or 300 people, and I don't know who I should talk to, why I should talk to them, how I should approach them. So having somebody with that kind of guidance to, of these are the steps that you should take, these are the process that you should work towards, and having that elevator pitch of who you are or what you're about, I think is a great way for people to kind of break the ice. And it doesn't have to come across scripted, it can come across very casual, like you had mentioned. You have 3 bullet points that you typically like to hit when you're having this conversation, just to kind of make sure everybody feels comfortable and natural. So I think that's a great skill that our students, and hopefully aspiring students, look to pick up as they kind of go through the program.
So we have about a little less than 30 minutes left, so I wanted to, everyone who's watching right now, I wanted to give you an opportunity and remind you to ask your questions on chat if you have any. We'll kind of end my interviewing of Mike, and then we'll start answering live questions. So kind of, I know that a frequent question students will have is, what can I do today? We have some very proactive students. So if they want to search for, if they want to position themselves the best they can to get a job after they graduate from the Nanodegree program, what should they do today?
Build. Put together any projects you can, as many projects as you can, put together as an elaborate project as you can. Do something. Show that you have something out there that you can show people or talk about and give your experience to. I think one of the worst things I've seen is when people tend to do the exact same thing as everybody else. Because when I look at resumes like that from previous employments, I always say, well, this person is basically the same version of this person. They don't have anything that's really different that distinguishes them. So either I think they're just kind of going through the motions and feeling like that's what's going to get them in place, or they feel like what they have there is good enough. And I think the world has changed so much even in the last 5 years, where you're no longer competing with people just in your area, right? For instance, us living here, we don't just compete with people in Silicon Valley for positions, right? We're competing with people worldwide, right? So I think making sure that you have enough projects and enough things that you feel like are unique enough to what you can do to show others is great. Now, it doesn't have to be the best thing in the world, right? But it needs to be yours, and you need to be proud of it and be able to kind of convey what you've done.
For sure, and I like that you repeated again that it doesn't have to be the best thing in the world, because no such project exists in real life. Like, if you work in a team, you're going to release the first version, fix it, improve it, release the second version, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's just how it works, and kind of the more you're comfortable with kind of like releasing a project that you're proud of, but you know that you can improve, that actually says a lot to an employer, that you understand kind of what the timeline is to improve a project. And for my advice to you from a career's perspective, from an employer's perspective, is when you're working on these personal projects, like they could be, something that you work on yourself, but have it be a passion project. Try to work with other people. You want to be able to go in an interview and talk about how you resolved an issue when you disagreed with someone. You want to be able to talk about how you communicate with someone. Let's say you're working on a project together and you're halfway around the world. How do you manage that? These are real life situations that you would encounter in a real life job. And the more you can point to them, just builds confidence in the employer, and they're gonna like imagine you in that role.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you're kind of talking about building and working and collaborating together. Part of the Udacity Explorers for the experience for this week actually is you're going to be working on the lab, which is meant to be open-ended. So you're going to be working with OpenAI, Gym, and RoboSchool to kind of do some reinforcement style learning. If you choose, it's up to you. It's totally optional. However much time and energy you want to put into it. But it's something that you can personalize. You can work with others. You can work with people either inside the classroom or outside of the classroom. You can be a mix of both. But the thing is, when you start doing these things and you start building and collaborating with people, who knows where that's going to lead you later on in life. Somebody might end up getting a job at a place that you want to go work at and that you've worked with 6 years ago, and you can be like, hey, remember the time we worked on this? And I heard that this company's hiring, is there any opportunity for us to kind of sit and talk again, just kind of get a feel if maybe I'd be a good fit over there? Open-ended style projects lead to all kinds of just different opportunities for you later in life. So I just highly recommend it.
Yeah, that just sounds exciting. It's exciting to work on something that just continually grows over time. That's awesome. I actually have one more thing to tell students, and this is entirely from a career portfolio perspective. Starting now, or hopefully you've started before, make sure when you do your work, make sure that it's kind of impeccable from the start. And when I say impeccable, I don't mean like the features are perfect. I mean when you do commits in GitHub, make sure that they look nice, that they're consistent. You don't know if this like small project you're working on will become your big project, later on. And you don't want someone to go into your repo and see like, these commits are not consistent at all. Will this person know how to have consistent commits in a real life setting? Make sure, start just making sure that think of everything that you work on as potentially something an employer might see. We have this awesome GitHub and collaboration course, and next engagement week, we'll have a project review to review your GitHub portfolio. That's when a reviewer will see if you're active, seeing if a recruiter looks at your profile, that they'll be attracted to it, and they'll also actually go over how your repos look, like if you're doing all the crossing the T's, doing polls correctly, stuff like that. And it's just to give you a longer history of best practices.
And I want to add just one thing from a higher level on to kind of cap that off with, as well, as just be professional. Be professional in anything that you have that's externally facing. Right? If you're going to put together a GitHub account and you're going to put in your code, make sure your code is commented well. Make sure you don't use profanity in your code, right? Make sure you have everything nice that you would present it to somebody in a professional setting. The more things that you can curate to kind of put out there that you're a professional and you're working towards being professional in the industry, the better it is. I think it sends a really good tone to whoever's looking to potentially employ you.
Okay, it's great. All right, so let's open it up to your questions. And I'll be reading them right here. So, question, I think this is for Mike. Would you say the Robotics Nanodegree Program covers all the important topics for becoming an industry professional? Are there other topics that we should learn about on our own?
So I think the Robotics Nanodegree Program, this is my personal opinion, I think it gives you a good base and a good range and a good exposure to a lot of different things. Unfortunately, like I said, it's only roughly around, I think, six months or so. program. So obviously the field is huge, and there's people who've been working in the field for 20 and 30 years who still feel like they don't know everything. So I think it gives you a good base, but I definitely think and I highly encourage you to kind of go out and explore different areas on your own, different topics on your own, and just see what's out there, see what interests you, try and build something in that space or work with something in that space to see if you like it.
So the next question is about which fields have the best hiring prospects. And before I even ask it, I want to do a caveat, and that job demand depends a lot on location. So where something is, like, let's say in San Francisco, this is like very popular, this field of robotics, but maybe in London or Shanghai, there's like a different field. So it's kind of your responsibility to do a job search and see what's out there. We see this for, let's say, like I've seen this, for example, in other fields. There are areas where there are more Android developers than iOS developers, and that's just kind of like how the industry built itself. It doesn't mean one is better than the other. It just means like where you are, where the opportunity is, this is what's popular. And so the question is, given that there are broadly 3 areas of research and active development, namely perception, decision, and action, which of these fields have the best hiring prospects?
So it really depends. I think all of them have great hiring aspects. I think the jobs are kind of dispersed across multiple fields, outside, inside and outside of robotics. So really, it's kind of up to you to kind of explore.
So our next question, we touched on this a bit, but for the people who don't have much previous experience in robotics, what sort of jobs should we be able to apply to by the end of the Nanodegree program?
I think you should be able to apply for entry-level robotics or roboticist style position. You should have some good skills in software and in simulation, and hopefully at the end of term 2, a little bit of hardware as well. So you should have a good set of skills to kind of get you in the door.
Our next question is, our next question asks is, like, can you get a job in robotics without any college degree? And I want to caveat that in that I feel like these are like kind of, I don't know how to describe it, but it's like you're kind of being your own devil's advocate. Instead, you should think about, like, how do I get this job that I may not on paper be qualified for? How do I make a case for myself?
Sure. So I think there's a really interesting thing, and I think college degrees are very important, and everybody who has one, I definitely think it's something there's something you learn in college that you may not get somewhere else in life. With that said, I still feel that work ethic makes up for a lot of different things. So I have friends who had owned their own companies in software in high school, who are now chief architects of major companies. So, who have no college degrees, they've actually dropped out of college. Mark Zuckerberg is obviously an example, right? Bill Gates is another example of people who didn't actually finish their degrees, who are still brilliant people. I think the real the big push there is actually work ethic and the ability to actually just not take no for an answer. Just be relentless. If somebody tells you no, well, there's somebody else out there, and you will find somebody that is willing to take you on and teach you, and they'll be very happy that they have you on board.
And I will say, kind of a couple years ago when we were trying to get students' job in machine learning, we're still doing that today. It was an uphill battle there were students without a college degree. Like, we couldn't kind of perceive that someone could be a data scientist without having a PhD. I can tell you today that we have graduates without any college experience who actually have the title data scientist. The kind of how industry views formal education is changing, and like what Mike said, if you don't have that degree, you make up for it in another way.
Make up for it in experience, and just even pet projects is a good way to kind of cover that gap.
Yeah, and also find jobs where they don't necessarily require that, and then be promoted. That's like the best way to do that. So our next question asks, robotics covers so many domains, and I find it difficult to be really good at all of control, kinematics, and perception, etc. I want to get a job sooner rather than later. Can I just focus on one topic?
So the robotics program actually is going to cover all of those topics to kind of give you a good base and everything. What I would recommend is if you're looking to kind of get a job sooner than later, maybe trying to pick a topic yourself to kind of explore as a self-discovery and self-study. That should hopefully help you kind of hone in on what you like.
And Mike, we were just talking about this before the AMA started, kind of what startups are looking for. So the student is asking, are startups looking for deep knowledge in some aspect of roboticists or generalists?
So this is a really good question. This is a question that comes up a lot, and you see it from a lot of different companies. So I can actually speak on this with a little bit of knowledge here. One of the things I've noticed is a lot of companies are actually looking for someone who's very much a specialist in one particular area. They have to have knowledge of everything, but they really like somebody to be a specialist in one area right now. I think that's going to change a lot more as robotics matures and becomes much more mainstream. I think you're going to see a lot more generalists kind of coming out. But there's places for both in the industry right now and places at a lot of companies for that as well.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. And then kind of on that topic actually, are there any specific hot topics right now in robotics?
So we have a few things that we're planning kind of coming up in the next few engagement weeks. But I think there's some new and emerging fields out there that are kind of exciting, but I'm not going to give them away just yet, so make sure you stay tuned.
Oh, that's awesome. So keep that in mind when you're working on your projects. You want to get to the finish line and then and then go for the next engagement week. So this question is about the portfolio. What is the best format for putting together a portfolio? I'll let Mike speak on this after, but I want to say first that like any portfolio is great. Let's say, for example, you want to do kind of like the data side of robotics. Having a blog post where you talk about your projects, that is actually a really fantastic way where someone can go see your visualization, see your report. And then I think their questions might also be about like how does a physical portfolio look like, if there's any.
Sure, yeah, so physical portfolio is something I'm hoping that Trin will be able to answer maybe starting in a couple of weeks. Unfortunately, I don't have a good way of describing this yet. But I think maybe, screenshots, YouTube, images and things like that might be a good way of kind of putting together more of a physical portfolio. Yeah. And I'm assuming if your robot's small enough or your item is small enough, bringing it with you to an interview is probably a good idea as well. Might give somebody something to talk about while they're there. Yeah, and I want to talk a bit actually about VR because I think they have kind of the same issue where their work can be non-physical or really physical. How do they portray that like online on a website? So a lot of VR developers or anyone in that industry, they have their own website. It could be a blog, but they actually go through their project and how they built their project. With Mike said, they have GIFs of them actually building it. They have screenshots. They have videos, and they just talk about how they went through the process. That is like essential in VR, and I think in robotics it is too, because that is how you tell someone that you give proof that you actually went through the process. Sure. It's also an incredible marketing tool. If someone like tweets your blog, you're just being surface to employers in many different ways. So I think that is a great thing to work on like right now, like start building that. Yeah, and I think one more thing, so for the community out there who actually has physical and hardware projects that they've built, make sure you discuss this in the general channel and kind of throw around some ideas of how others should do it as well.
Okay, the next question is that's great. I love this question because it means you want to work on projects now. What are some high visibility open source projects to get involved with?
So one of the things we're working with right now is we're going to actually work with OpenAI Gym and Robo School to do a little bit of reinforcement learning for some biologically inspired robots. So this week you'll have the opportunity to kind of dig through the code kind of at your own level and investigate humanoid robots, ants, cheetahs, hopping robots, and kind of playing around with some algorithms, kind of trying your own thing, maybe seeing what's there, maybe looking at what's been implemented. One of the nice things about this is there's actually a benchmarking system inside of OpenAI Gym, so you can actually test to see how well you're doing. And so a lot of people have done this already, so you can actually go in and look at some other people's code, and you can see what they've done, and you might be able to try to iterate or expand upon what they've done. So that's a kind of a fun way to kind of get involved for this week. We have some other ones planned for a few weeks from now, so stay tuned for that.
So the next question is about our offerings in general, about which nanodegree program would complement the RoboND. I think it depends on what you want to do, right? We have the AI nanodegree, we have like full stack. I really think it just, you need to kind of explore what you're interested in and then see if Udacity has a curriculum that matches those interests. I
definitely agree with that. I definitely see, if you're looking to kind of tie robotics and front-end development together, kind of figure out what's the bridge. How do I go about doing that? I think that's great. Some areas that I can say that people generally come from if they're going to do robo, they usually come from self-driving car, machine learning, deep learning, or AI. And I think all of those are actually really good fields to kind of work and tie into robotics. There's a huge movement right now of using a lot of deep reinforcement learning to do robotics research. And obviously AI is not going anywhere as far as robots are concerned, right? Everybody wants a robot that's going to run around and do their work for them.
We have a robot running around Udacity, but it doesn't do my work for me.
Yes.
So this is a question from someone with a mechanical engineering background, and they ask which specific areas of the robotics job market they could focus on with their background.
So mechanical engineering, a lot of those actually come from, in my opinion, I'm not a mechanical engineer, so let me just, preface it with that. I think they come a lot more from the mechanical side of like how parts are going to move and controls and things like that. I think that's probably a good fit. Unfortunately, like I said, this is not my area. I can't speak too in depth about it. I would suggest talking to some other mechanical engineers.
The next question we may have to ask you to write in because it's from an agricultural engineering student who asked for projects as your final year project. I'm not quite sure what that means. Is it so you can write into us and we can offer you more advice for your contacts, but I'm assuming you're just kind of asking like kind of what Mike touched on. How do you work on a project that bridges between agriculture and robotics?
So it's a good question if you're trying to figure out how do you tie agriculture and robotics together. There's quite a few companies out there right now that are doing some research and trying to put together some products. There's actually a few companies that actually have products right now. Blue River Technologies, which is located, I believe, in Sunnyvale, they actually have a product that they're actually using right now in the field. And there's some other companies. I know Traptic was in here a few weeks ago. Lewis Anderson, the CEO, and he and I were talking, and they're actually working on a strawberry picking robot, so a mechanical arm for picking strawberries because there's such a shortage of labor in the field. Not to actually replace people, but just to kind of help assist people in the field. So there's a lot of places out there, and there's some companies all over the world. I know there's another big company, I believe, that's in Spain that's doing something in the agricultural space. So just kind of try to look around and try to find something unique or try to find a challenge that you see from an agricultural perspective, and you're just like, you know what, this needs to be addressed, and I think it could be addressed in this fashion. Let's try that.
That's awesome. That's great advice for how you work on something new. I think people ask all the time, how can I do something innovative? And that is really like see what's out there, see what can be improved,
right,
and then work toward that. So this question I think is also for you, Mike. Is it possible to build an intelligent robotic operating system that is able to run not only on all hardware, but also learns its sensors and learns what it has to do?
Is it possible? Probably. I'm not entirely sure. When? That's a good question too. So, but ROS is a good alternative. Well, not an alternative necessarily, but it's a good platform right now it's basically built mostly for Linux. You can run it on some other platforms with a lot of work, but it does a lot of the generic messaging control.
Awesome.
Yeah.
We have a curriculum question next. For Mike too,
yes,
and this also might be a spoiler. Will you include nonlinear control techniques in the Robotics Nanodegree?
So unfortunately, I'm not able to answer that question without the syllabus in front of me, but that would be a great question for our content developers, and I believe they are working very hard on putting something together.
So stay tuned. Another question we have is also about bridging. I think a lot of students will have these questions, and I encourage about how to take your current background and bridge it to robotics. I encourage you to go on Slack like right now, right after this, and just talk with people. You'll get ideas from different students. They'll point you toward areas. They might even be able to refer you to someone who's done something similar, and then you'll just learn and you'll get ideas. So this question, it says, a lot of personal projects involve low voltage and low power components, whereas the majority of industry applications involve high voltage and high power systems. What is a good way to bridge this?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for you on that. I'm sorry. Like I said, I don't have the electrical background. I think just getting some general knowledge on working with low voltage, low power, and then kind of investigating and researching, high voltage, high power situations. I know there's a lot of problems with some of the sensors that you choose and how they're arranged inside of a robotic system, but unfortunately, it's not my area.
So I think we'll end taking live questions right now because we're almost done, but feel free to always write into us. You can ask questions on Slack. If you have career-specific questions, write into career-support@udacity.com, and we'll also advertise these links for you so you don't have to write them down right now. The question I have is actually for both me and Mike, but kind of we want to tell you what we're most excited for coming up next in the Robotics Nanodegree. Let Mike go first.
Yeah, so definitely. So Thomas has been putting together a wonderful lesson on kinematics, so I'm very excited to kind of get my hands on that and kind of go through that material. So Thomas works for Electric Movement, is one of our partners. Brandon has put together some great content right now on ROS, and I know Harsh has been working very hard on a couple of the projects. One of the projects I believe is going to be released today, so make sure you stay tuned for that. It's going to be really exciting. Some other areas of robotics that I'm particularly interested in is soft robotics is an area that I think is going to start making a little bit more of a splash than it has so far. But stay tuned for more on that. What about you, Trin?
And I'm excited for you all to graduate and get jobs. It's not going to be something that happens today. It may take you a few months after you graduate from the program. But I have looked at some of your resumes. I have kind of talked with a lot of people about robotics jobs in a while, and I see a path for every single person to find their way into the field. And I'm excited to work with you. You'll see my face again in the career engagement parts, working on your resume, your LinkedIn, your interview practice, and then being able to connect you with our amazing career counselors who come from all sorts of backgrounds. Every single one of them did a career change. Some came from like the restaurant industry and are now software engineers. So I'm excited to connect you with our larger group and our thousands of alumni in jobs and help them help you get a job.
So I have two last things I want to mention before we go off air right now. One is to please continue this discussion at robotics.udacity.com. That's our way to sign up for our Slack community. We already have over 2,000 people in there who are either aspiring roboticists or actual roboticists in the industry. I'm sure everybody would love to talk and kind of get to know each other. The other thing is this week during our engagement week, we're also happy to announce that Yoki from Nest has actually done an interview with Sebastian Thrun. So make sure you look out for that. I believe that's airing today at...
it's airing today, I think, at 5 o'clock Pacific time.
Okay.
It's on Udacity Talks, so search for Udacity Talks and you'll be able to find it. And we'll also send it out.
So don't miss it. It's actually a fantastic talk.
All right, thank you so much for joining us. We want you to know that we're kind of here for you the entire journey, including after graduation. So don't be afraid to reach out and work on your projects right now.
Yeah, so have fun and enjoy learning.
Okay, bye.